Great. Okay, super. Yes, well, good morning, everybody. And it's a real pleasure to be at this 12th West Africa Task Force meeting. Good. I'm going to talk to you about the new report, Transhipment Issues and Solutions in the FCWC Region. This is quite a big report that has taken several years of research between the FCWC countries and Secretariat, Stop Illegal Fishing and Trig Mark Tracking. It's a piece of work that started as a response to the FCWC strategy on transshipment, but it's very much linked to the process that we're in at the moment on developing voluntary guidelines for transshipment at the UN. And the idea was to do this research so that we could see what is really happening in the region, how transshipment relates to the FCWC countries, to empower bigger discussion at this UN. And I think that Didi will be speaking about that after me. It's a big report. You can see there on the table of contents, it's over 100 pages with 3 main sections. The first one about the region, the second one goes into operational transshipment, and the third one draws out the main issues and solutions for the region. I'm going to go fairly quickly through section 1 and 2, just to give you a taste for them. And then I'm going to talk a bit more about the issues and solutions or responses. Good, so section 1, this is about the region, and it sets the scene for how transshipment in the FCWC should be viewed. And the first section is about the countries. Of course, I think you all know we're talking about the 6 FCWC countries. And for each one, there is a double-page spread like this that will introduce the ports, the legal framework. And quite important, the fish that is being imported or exported from each of these countries. What happens then is there's a section on trade. So this draws from all of those national reviews and looks at fish trade in the whole region. Why this is important is because it is the trade of fish which brings the transshipment. Transshipment is the movement of fish from the catching vessel to another type of vessel. So what we can see here is that, and I think this is really interesting, that we have imports and exports in the FCWC region by tons, and then we have imports and exports by value. And this is just an interesting statistic that we import about 1.5 million tons of fish. Well, we export quite a small amount, but by value, that is a magnitude larger. And what that tells us is that the fish we're importing is on average costing $1 per kilogram. Whereas if you have a look at the exports, the fish that we're exporting is about $8 per kilogram, which is quite an interesting comparison when you're thinking about where we value transshipment. The region then looks at the fish, and the way that we've grouped the fish for transshipment is into these 3 categories you can see here. All pelagics, demersals, tuna, and crustacean and mollusks. So these groupings are from the diagrams you can see here. This is in value. You can see the imports, this one here is imports, and this one is exports. So look at that. We are importing a much higher amount of small pelagics into the region. And these are for consumption mainly in our countries and the hinterlands, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali. Whereas what we're exporting is mainly tuna and crustacean and mollusks, which are going, as you can see there from the red, mainly to Europe. This I'll come back to later because it's quite interesting to see of the importance of, obviously we want to monitor the movement of fish. So where are we putting our efforts on monitoring? But okay, so that's the first chapter, and I hope that you'll be able to look at it and you'll see that it's setting the scene of our regional context. Middle section, section 2, it's a really big section. This looks into the operational detail of transhipment. It's a really interesting section, and I'm going to just kind of give you an overview today so that it will help you when you have a look at the actual report. This report, transhipment is classified into 5 different groups, and that is transhipment linked to reefers, containers, factory vessels, converted fishing vessels, and small transport vessels. And that is how the chapter is divided up. It looks in those 5 categories. One of the things that it's really important to say at the beginning is that definitions of vessel types, definition of what is transhipment, what is landing, are all very grey. There is not universal agreement on this. I'll come to that at the end. But in the report, we have actually defined how we refer to vessels for the purpose of the report, which has been based on what is operationally normal in the region. So now let me have a look in a little bit of detail about transhipment and reefers. This is the biggest section of the different types, but I'm going to touch on this one a little bit and then just mention the others. So when we looked at reefers, quite a lot of the work was based on a very interesting study that took place over the period of 2018. And that was a study by TMT and Global Fishing Watch, where they looked at the movement of reefers in the FCWC region and outside. So this was any reefers that at any point during that time came into the FCWC region. They mainly used AIS, but also other databases, and they analysed and looked at this information. And it gives us some very interesting insight. It covered 149 reefers. And if you look at this first graph here, you can see the flag states of those that had over 5 reefers. And it was the Comoros, Russia, St. Kitts and Nevis, Liberia, Panama, and the Bahamas. So they were the most active reefers in the FCWC region in that year. The analysis also gives you a lot more information. I really am just touching on it here. And for the sake of the analysis, the reefers were grouped into four groups depending on how they operated. And this was Africa specialized, to reefers that just focused in Africa, those that moved between Africa and Europe, those that had a global reach, and those that really were just transiting through. And there's a lot of analysis, like this graph here is interesting because it tells us that, for example, the reefers only operating in Africa, they tended to be smaller. Their average gross tonnage was smaller, but they were older. They were moving up to over 30 years on average, which is quite different to those that were in transit, that tended to be much larger and a little bit younger. So this analysis, based on these 149 reefers, was used particularly and extremely interestingly to look at risk factors. When MCS work is happening, you see a reefer coming into port, how do you know which ones are likely to have operated illegally? This information is very difficult for an inspector to understand. So this analysis looked at factors that would help to identify a risk of non-compliant behavior. And it looks at encounters, loitering, AIS gaps, history of non-compliance, and flagging issues. Just put the last four, I've just put an example to show you the kind of information you can find. So this first one here is on loitering. And that shows you which EZs were the most common outside of the FCWC region for loitering, which is an indication that transshipment may have taken place and potentially illegal transshipment. And while we can see that there's a lot on the high seas, we can also see important EZs for imports for us, such as Angola, Mauritania, Senegal. This donut looks at the AIS gaps within the EZs of the FCWC region. And what I find interesting here is that we see these risk factors of when the AIS has been turned off in all of the EZs. So that's quite interesting. It's not just, it's more in some, but all of the EZs have that. This one looks at non-compliance. So you can look at a vessel and explore, has it got a history, or have the owners and operators got a history of non-compliance? This is the owners and operators, and 23 of those vessels indicated a non-compliance activity, showing again a little bit more risk, perhaps a vessel you should focus on. And finally here, an example of flagging, and which vessels, 20 of them, were engaged in flag hopping. So I think that this is a really interesting part of the study to show you how you can consider risk factors for the reefers. So then in the different sections of the reefers, whichever type, there's case studies. And this is just an example I've put up to show you how they look. The case studies have been set up using these icons that help you to understand the information. You can see that this example is looking at small pelagics, and these were the type of risk factors that came up. You then see the information, you can see maps. This will show you the movement of the reefers. Here we've got a Las Palmas, so a Europe to Africa, and information on compliance. There's many of these examples in the report that give you a good insight into different types of reefer or any of the transshipments. Good. I'm not going to go into detail on these because I want to move on to the issues, but I just want to show you that the diversity of transshipment in our region. So there's a section on transshipment and containers. There is another section that looks at the interesting factory vessels. These are the vessels that do some processing on board, either for fish or fish meal. There's another section that looks at this area, this somewhat grey area, I would say, of converted fishing vessels. These are vessels that some of them are converted for short periods, some are permanently converted to be transport vessels. In transshipment looks at the transshipment in relation to small transport vessels. This has been discussed quite a bit during the meeting. This is, for example, the psycho or transshipment to these smaller fishing vessels, which is a big issue in our region. Good. So those are the first two sections, and that analysis on the region, the fish, the trade, and on the different types of transshipment was then analysed and looked at from a view to what are the cross-cutting issues and the challenges that we are facing in the FCWC region to firstly implement our transshipment strategy, and secondly, that as countries and as a region, we need to think about in the bigger picture of this negotiation of international guidelines. We had 7. I'm already going to speak for a long time, so I've decided to just speak on 4 of these today. But I would really encourage you to have a look at all of the issues. They're all important. I've just picked a few to highlight some of the things that we need to be focusing on. The first one is very general. It is about definition and interpretation. And this is an incredibly important issue, not just with transshipment. We've seen it in relation to implementing port state measures. We've seen it in very many areas. And as an English speaker, I know that we have a lot of problems just with English when we don't even consider bringing in French, or in other parts of Africa, Portuguese. The challenge we have here is that when definitions are not clear, and we're not clear, are we talking about transshipment? Are we talking about landing? Does transshipment does the movement of fish in your port, when it comes onto the quay and then straight back onto another reefer vessel, is that transshipment? Is that landing? All of this is a very grey area. And that causes a lot of problems when you then need to decide where to put your MCS effort. What are you monitoring? This is also a problem when it comes to the definition of fishing vessels, how that is interpreted. It's also about which catches. As you saw in the transshipment section, we show how this linkage between industrial and small scale, it's not clear. There's a lot of grey area. And are important for the legal interpretation and the practical MCS and tariffs and taxes. So what could we be doing, and what should we be thinking about in that international process? We need well-defined wording. We need to differentiate between the different types of transshipment. We need to try to be in line with other FAO instruments, but this is also difficult because there's an evolution in the global process. We used to talk about auxiliary or ancillary vessels. Now we tend to talk about fishing and related activities. The Port State Measures Agreement has got our most recent definitions. We need to think and make sure that our small-scale fisheries are included there. Make sure that definitions and interpretations are relevant in the broader regional scenarios. So I think my main message here is, if you're participating in that international negotiation, let's make sure that the definitions will cover our transshipment types in the FCWC region. Okay, the second issue I want to touch on. This is very troubling. This is the issue of regulatory gaps and loopholes. Today, with no international guideline, transshipment is implemented through national legislation and regional legislation. Nationally, in your laws, your regulations, even your procedures, you will have the rules on transshipment that may apply to your flagged vessels or your EEZs and your ports. They may be very different, even within the region, let alone other countries. We then have the regional framework. And in this diagram, you can see I've put the 2 types of regional fisheries management organizations. They are the regional bodies with a management mandate. They can make conservation and management measures. So they can make the rules, whereas the advisory bodies, like the FCWC, they are part of the process of implementing ensuring that the guidelines are implemented, but not through binding agreements. Or I should say binding conservation and management measures. The issue we have is that while the tuna RFMOs, which there's 5 in the world, cover quite a large area. This is ICAT here, which is very important, of course, to our region for the tuna in West Africa. So that means that we have a good set of rules and regulations on transshipment for tuna species caught here. Whereas when we look at the non-tuna species, we have a lot of gaps. And if you think back to that slide I showed earlier with the small pelagics, we import a lot of small pelagics from West Africa, Angola, other parts of Africa. These are not under any regional regime, any conservation and management measures. And this is very troubling because what it means is that in our ports, the inspectors in the FCWC region will focus on monitoring the transshipment of species from the monitored fisheries, not from the unmonitored or unregulated fisheries. Because the rules are unclear, which rules apply. This for me is a really important area that we need to work on, because sustainability of fish stocks is what we're fighting for. We're fighting to have all of our fish stocks sustainable, to continue to benefit our region, to have blue growth, to feed our people. And if we're only focusing on the species that are well managed, that are generally exported, we're actually not looking after the African future. So we need to rebalance this, and we need to make sure that the regulatory frameworks are more comprehensive so that our MCS capacity and effort is not skewed or distorted. We need to fight for comprehensive regulatory systems. We need to focus and improve our MCS capacity on all species and increase monitoring requirements, particularly for these species that are feeding our countries. This leads me into my third of the 4 issues I'm going to talk about, and this is rethinking blue growth. You may wonder why blue growth and transshipment link, but just bear with me and I'll draw the links on the next slide. We're talking a lot now about blue growth, oceans, getting the most from our oceans, growing vegetables in our ocean, not wasting our food. This is important. It links to maritime security. It links to the social and economic development of our countries. But there's a major imbalance here as well. A lot of the agendas in respect to fisheries are driven by the powerful players globally. And that is the distant water fishing nations, which is China, Chinese Taipei, Taiwan, Spain, South Korea, and the powerful fishing industry. And because they are powerful, they are influencing a lot of the discussions in those regional frameworks that I was talking about, the RFMOs. We also have subsidies playing an enormous role here and limiting equitable blue growth, because a lot of the larger distant water fishing nations are supported by subsidies. I'm sure many of you know about the global discussions on this issue. But what's essentially happening is harmful subsidies are limiting the growth of the FCWC countries' participation. So if we want change, if we want equitable blue growth, we need to change this status quo and influence the discussions. And that's why this is linked to transshipment, because transshipment is so important in the supply chain of fish. Fish has to get off the fishing boat. It needs to get either onto another boat. It needs to eventually get to land. At the moment, a lot of this thinking has not been really incorporated into the voluntary guidelines that are in draft at the moment globally. And the small-scale fisheries voluntary guidelines had a very inclusive approach. And I definitely think that there's room for us to grow the approach of the transshipment guidelines. Make sure that there's text there that is going to encourage local landing of a fish and seafood, that we encourage local ownership, that we have smart policies for blue growth, looking at environmentally sound policies and ones that promote nutrition and employment in our populations. I also, sorry, I missed a point there. Somebody came into my office. We also want to promote here the growth of the domestic markets and this importing of high protein products. Good. So my bottom message there is that by guiding transshipment, we need to think about the bigger picture of what we're aiming for in the region. Okay, this is my last of the issues, and this is something I know it's very dear to everybody's hearts, is capacity. Capacity growth in the region and the critical points. So we need to look at where are the prioritized points in transshipment. Where do we need to get access for our inspectors to port and anchorages? Where do we need to get access to information? For example, the advanced request for entry into port. How can we do this risk assessment? We need the capacity risk assessment. Earlier, I spoke about the risk assessment done on the reefers, those high risk factors. We need to think about how we can have the capacity to ensure that we can do that risk assessment, taking into account the information and then access to places to do inspections. We need the capacity to cooperate. I would say that many of these issues around capacity are aligned with what we've been seeing with implementing port state measures, which actually gives us an opportunity. When we're thinking about now guidelines and implementing our own transshipment strategy, we need to look at these points, these critical points where we need more MCS capacity for monitoring. We need to think about the human resources we need. If we're going to monitor transshipment from flag states that are not in our region, if we're going to monitor that transshipment when that fish is going to be consumed outside of our region, then we need more help and assistance to do that monitoring. Because at the moment, we're monitoring a lot more of foreign flag states and export species than we are of the species that is important for our region. So we need to demand more financial support for that capacity, both the training and the implementation. We need to ensure that we've got access to the information from those flag states and other port states. And as I said, we need the better access, which could be about national laws there, to have the access for our inspectors. Of course, interagency cooperation for multi-agency inspections, something that we've been talking about this week. Good, so that was 4 of the issues I talked about to give you a taste for what's been drawn out of the analysis. There's other ones in the report, but I can't speak about everything today. So I've just got 3 last slides where I'm going to quickly touch on the responses. And this is to really show that although there's a lot to deal with, the FCWC region has already made 3 very major moves towards improving the situation on monitoring transshipment and the framework. The first one is the West Africa Task Force. Over the last years, this has helped to improve a lot of cross-checking of information, sharing of information. It's promoted transparency and good governance nationally and across the region. So the continued work of the West Africa Task Force has a great value, especially when the guidelines are developed. Secondly, I think that this region should be highly commended on its forward-thinking transshipment strategy. This has been approved by the ministers, by your ministers, and it promotes a regional approach, and that is essential. It sets out requirements for MCS, and it promotes some of the international best practice, such as mandatory vessel monitoring systems, automatic identifying systems, and the International Maritime Organization numbers for fishing vessels. And thirdly, the launch of the regional MCS Centre last year was an enormous step forward. And I think that the role that this centre is going to play now in implementing port state measures and the guidelines on transshipments once they've been approved is really big, and it's an excellent opportunity for all the countries. They will be able to coordinate transshipment monitoring and oversight, sharing that information, such as those risk factors we talked about, combining information sources, and ensuring that the cooperation is there for the monitoring. So it's going to be very exciting to see how the MCS Centre can grow and take on these international guidelines, such as the transshipment guidelines that are being developed now. Thank you very much. Thank you, Didi. Thank you, everybody there in Nigeria. I hope that's given you a taste of the report, and that you will all delve into it and be well charged and ready to go into the negotiations at the end of the month. Thank you very much. Over to you in Nigeria.